Chapter 22 of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 22. A Letter from Murray. The girl opposite him looked up from the card before her. The lines of her face were softened by the suggestion of a contented smile.
"My gracious!" she exclaimed. "What's the matter now? You look as though you'd lost your last friend."
Jimmy quickly forced a smile to his lips. "On the contrary," he said, "I think I've found a regular friend in you." It was easy to see that his words pleased her. "No," continued Jimmy, "I was thinking of what an awful mess I make of everything I tackle."
"You're not making any mess of this new job," she said. "You're making good. You see, my hunch was all right."
"I wish you hadn't had your hunch," he said with a smile. "It's going to bring a lot of trouble to several people, but now that I'm in it, I'm going to stick to it to a finish." The girl's eyes were wandering around the room, taking in the faces of the diners about them. Suddenly she extended her hand and laid it on Jimmy's.
"For the love of Mike!" she exclaimed. "Look over there."
Slowly Jimmy turned his eyes in the direction she indicated. "What do you know about that?" he ejaculated. "Steve Murray and Bince."
"And thick as thieves,"
said the girl. "Naturally," commented Jimmy. The two men left the restaurant before Edith and Jimmy had finished their supper, leaving the two hazarding various guesses as to the reason for their meeting.
"You can bet it's for no good," said the girl. "I've known Murray for a long time, and I never knew him to do a decent thing in his life."
Their supper over, they walked to Clark Street and took a northbound car, but after alighting, Jimmy walked with the girl to the entrance of her apartment. "I can't thank you enough," he said, "for giving me this evening. It is the only evening I have enjoyed since I struck this town last July." He unlocked the outer door for her and was holding it open.
"It is I who ought to thank you," she said.
Her voice was very low and filled with suppressed feeling.
"I ought to thank you, for this has been the happiest evening of my life."
And as though she could not trust herself to say more, she entered the hallway and closed the door between them. As Jimmy turned away to retrace his steps to the car line, he found his mind suddenly in a whirl of jumbled emotions, for he was not so stupid as to have failed to grasp something of the significance of the girl's words and manner. "Hell," he muttered. "Look what I've done now." The girl hurried to her room and turned on the lights, and again she seated herself before her mirror, and for a moment sat staring at the countenance reflected before her. She saw lips parted to rapid breathing, lips that curved sweetly in a happy smile, and then as she sat there looking, she saw the expression of the face before her change. The lips ceased to smile. The soft brown eyes went wide and staring as though in sudden horror. For a moment she sat thus, and then throwing her body forward upon her dressing table, she buried her face in her arms.
"My God!" she cried through choking sobs.
Mason Compton was at his office the next morning, contrary to the pleas of his daughter and the orders of his physician. Bince was feeling more cheerful. Murray had assured him that there was a way out. He would not tell Bince what the way was.
"Well, leave it to me," he said. "The less you know, the better off you'll be. What you want is to get rid of this fresh guy and have all the papers in a certain vault destroyed. You see to it that only the papers you want destroyed are in that vault, and I'll do the rest."
All of which relieved Mr. Harold Bince's elastic conscience of any feeling of responsibility in the matter. Whatever Murray did was no business of his. He was glad that Murray hadn't told him. He greeted Jimmy Torrance almost affably, but he lost something of his self-composure when Mason Compton arrived at the office, for Bince had been sure that his employer would be laid up for at least another week, during which time Murray would have completed his work. The noon mail brought a letter from Murray. "Show the enclosed to Compton," it read. "Tell him you found it on your desk and destroy this letter." The enclosure was a crudely printed note on a piece of soiled wrapping paper: "Treat your men right or suffer the consequences. I.W.W." Bince laid Murray's letter face down upon the balance of the open mail, and sat for a long time looking at the ominous words of the enclosure. At first he was inclined to be frightened, but finally a crooked smile twisted his lips. "Murray's not such a fool after all," he soliloquized. "He's framing an alibi before he starts." With the note in his hand, Bince entered Compton's office, where he found the latter dictating to Edith Hudson. "Look at this thing!" exclaimed Bince, laying the note before Compton. "What do you suppose it means?" Compton read it, and his brows knitted. "Have the men been complaining at all?" he asked. "Recently I have heard a little grumbling," replied Bince. "They haven't taken very kindly to Torrance's changes. I guess some of them are afraid they're going to lose their jobs. As you know, he is cutting down the force in order to cut costs." "Yeah, he ought to know about this," said Compton. "Wait, I'll have him in." And he pressed a button on his desk. A moment later Jimmy entered, and Compton showed him the note. "What do you think of it?" asked Compton. "I doubt if it amounts to much," replied Jimmy. "The men have no grievance. It may be the work of some fellow who is afraid of his job, but I doubt if it really emanates from any organized scheme or intimidation. If I were you, sir, I would simply ignore it." To Jimmy's surprise, Bince agreed with him. It was the first time that Bince had agreed with anything Jimmy had suggested. "Very well," asserted Compton. "But we'll preserve this bit of evidence in case we may need it later." And he handed the slip of paper to Edith Hudson. "File this, please, Miss Hudson," he said, and then, turning to Bince, "It may be nothing, but I don't like the idea of it. There is apt to be something underlying this, or even if it is only a single individual and he happens to be a crank, he could cause a lot of trouble. Suppose, for instance, one of those crack-brained foreigners in the shop got it into his head that Torrance here was grinding him down in order to increase our profits. Why, he might attack him at any time. I tell you, we have got to be prepared for such a contingency, especially now that we have concrete evidence that there is such a man in our employ. I think you ought to be armed, Mr. Torrance. Have you a pistol?" Jimmy shook his head negatively. "No, sir," he said, "not here." Compton opened a desk drawer. "Take this one," he said, and handed Jimmy an automatic. The latter smiled. "Really, Mr. Compton," he said, "I don't believe I need such an article." "I want you to take it," insisted Compton. "I want you to be on the safe side." A moment later Bince and Jimmy left the office together. Jimmy still carried the pistol in his hand. "You'd better put that thing in your pocket," cautioned Bince. They were in the small office on which Compton's and Bince's office opened, and Jimmy had stopped beside the desk that had been placed there for him. "I think I'll leave it here," he said. "The thing would be a nuisance in my pocket," and he dropped it into one of the desk drawers, while Bince continued his way toward the shop. Compton was looking through the papers and letters on his desk, evidently searching for something which he could not find, while the girl sat waiting for him to continue his dictation. "That's funny," commented Compton. "I was certain that letter was here. Have you seen anything of a letter from Mosher?" "No, sir," replied Edith. "Well, I wish you would step into Mr. Bince's office and see if it is on his desk." Upon the assistant general manager's desk lay a small pile of papers, face down, which Edith proceeded to examine in search of the Mosher letter. She had turned them all over at once, commencing at what had previously been the bottom of the pile, so that she ran through them all without finding the Mosher letter before she came to Murray's epistle. As its import dawned upon her, her eyes widened at first in surprise and then narrowed as she realized the value of her discovery. At first she placed the letter back with the others just as she had found them, but on second thought she took it up quickly and, folding it, slipped it inside her waist. Then she returned to Compton's office.
I cannot find the Mosher letter,
she said. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23 of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 23. Laid Up. Harriet Holden was sitting in Elizabeth's boudoir.
"And he has the effrontery," the latter was saying, "to tell me what I must do and must not do. The idea! A miserable little milk wagon driver dictating to me."
Miss Holden smiled.
"I should not call him very little," she remarked. "I didn't mean physically," retorted Elizabeth. "It is absolutely insufferable. I'm going to demand that father discharge the man." "And suppose he asks you why?" asked Harriet. "You will tell him, of course, that you want this person discharged because he protected you from the insults and attacks of a ruffian while you were dining at Feinheimer's at night. Is that it?" "You are utterly impossible, Harriet," cried Elizabeth, stamping her foot. "You are as bad as that efficiency person. But then I might have expected it. You have always, it seems to me, shown a great deal more interest in the fellow than necessary, and probably the fact that Harold doesn't like him is enough to make you partial toward him. For you have never tried to hide the fact that you don't like Harold." "If you're going to be cross," said Harriet, "I think I shall go home." At about the same time the Lizard entered Feinheimer's. In the far corner of the room Murray was seated at a table. The Lizard approached and sat down opposite. "Here I am," he said. "What do you want, and how do you know I was in town?"
"I didn't know," said Murray. "I got a swell job for you, and so I sent out word to get you."
"You're in luck, then," said the Lizard. "I just blew in this morning. What kind of job you got?"
Murray explained at length.
"They got a watchman," he concluded, "but I got a guy on the inside that'll fix him."
"When do I pull this off?"
asked the Lizard.
"In about a week. I'll let you know the night later. They ordinarily draw the payroll money Monday, the same day they pay, but this week they'll draw it Saturday and leave it in the safe. It'll be laying on top of a bunch of books and papers. They're the things you're to destroy. As I told you, it will all be fixed up from the inside. There's no danger of a pinch. All you got to do is crack the safe, put about a $4,000 or $5,000 roll in your pocket, and as you cross the river, drop a handful of books and papers in. Nothing to it. It's the easiest graft you ever had."
"You're sure that's all?"
asked the Lizard.
"Sure thing,"
replied Murray.
"Where's the place?"
"That I can't tell you until the day we're ready to pull off the job."
At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Jimmy Torrance collapsed at his desk. The flu had struck him as suddenly and as unexpectedly as it had attacked many of its victims. Edith Hudson found him and immediately notified Mr. Compton, with the result that half an hour later Jimmy Torrance was in a small private hospital in Park Avenue. That night Bince got Murray over the phone. He told him of Jimmy's sickness.
"He's balled up the whole plan," he complained. "We've either got to wait until he croaks or is out again before we can go ahead, unless something else arises to make it necessary to act before. I think I can hold things off, though, at this end, all right."
For 4 or 5 days Jimmy was a pretty sick man. He was allowed to see no one, but even if Jimmy had been in condition to give the matter any thought, he would not have expected to see anyone. For who was there to visit him in the hospital? Who was there who knew of his illness, to care whether he was sick or well, alive or dead? It was on the 5th day that Jimmy commenced to take notice of anything. At Compton's orders he had been placed in a private room and given a special nurse, and today for the first time he learned of Mr. Compton's kindness and the fact that the nurse was instructed to call Jimmy's employer twice a day and report the patient's condition.
"Mighty nice of him,"
thought Jimmy, and then to the nurse,
"And the flowers, too? Does he send those?"
The young woman shook her head negatively.
"No," she said. "A young lady comes every evening about 6 and leaves the flowers. She always asks about your condition and when she may see you."
Jimmy was silent for some time.
"She comes every evening,"
he asked.
Yes, replied the nurse.
May I see her this evening? Asked Jimmy.
We'll ask the doctor, she replied.
And the doctor must have given consent, for at 6 o'clock that evening the nurse brought Edith Hudson to his bedside. The girl came every evening thereafter and sat with Jimmy as long as the nurse would permit her to remain. Jimmy discovered during those periods a new side to her character, a mothering tenderness that filled him with a feeling of content and happiness the moment that she entered the room, and which doubtless aided materially in his rapid convalescence. For until she had been permitted to see him, Jimmy had suffered as much from mental depression as from any other of the symptoms of his disease. He had felt utterly alone and uncared for, and in this mental state he had brooded over his failures to such an extent that he had reached a point where he felt that death would be something of a relief. Militating against his recovery had been the parting words of Elizabeth Compton the evening that he had dined at her father's home, but now all that was very nearly forgotten, at least crowded into the dim vistas of recollection by the unselfish friendship of this girl of the streets. Jimmy's nurse quite fell in love with Edith.
She is such a sweet girl, she said, and always so cheerful. She's going to make someone a mighty good wife.
And she smiled knowingly at Jimmy. The suggestion which her words implied came to Jimmy as a distinct shock. He had never thought of Edith Hudson in the light of this suggestion, and now he wondered if there could be any such sentiment as it implied in Edith's heart. But finally he put the idea away with a shrug. Impossible, he thought. She thinks of me as I think of her, only as a good friend. End of chapter 23. Of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 24. In the Toils. At the office of the International Machine Company, the work of the CPAs was drawing to a close. Their report would soon be ready to submit to Mr. Compton, and as the time approached, Bince's nervousness and irritability increased. Edith noticed that he inquired each day with growing solicitude as to the reports from the hospital relative to Jimmy's condition. She knew that Bince disliked Jimmy, and yet the man seemed strangely anxious for his recovery and return to work. In accordance with Jimmy's plan, the CPAs were to give out no information to anyone, even to Mr. Compton, until their investigation and report were entirely completed. This plan had been approved by Mr. Compton, although he professed to be at considerable loss to understand why it was necessary. It was, however, in accordance with Jimmy's plan to prevent, if possible, any interference with the work of the auditors until every available fact in the case had been ascertained and recorded. In the investigation of the payroll, Bince had worked diligently with the accountants. As a matter of fact, he had never left them a moment while the payroll records were in their hands, and had gone to much pain to explain in detail every question arising therefrom. Although the investigators seemed to accept his statements at their face value, the assistant general manager was far from being assured that their final report would redound to his credit. On a Thursday, they informed him that they had completed their investigation, and the report would be submitted to Mr. Compton on Saturday. When Edith reached the hospital that evening, she found Jimmy in high spirits. He was dressed for the first time, and assured her that he was quite able to return to work if the doctor would let him, but the nurse shook her head.
"You ought to stay here for another week or 10 days," she admonished him.
"Nothing doing," cried Jimmy. "I'll be out of here Monday at the latest." But when Edith told him that the CPAs had finished and that their report would be handed in Saturday, Jimmy announced that he would leave the hospital the following day.
"But you can't do it," said the nurse.
"Why not?" asked Jimmy.
"The doctor won't permit it."
Edith tried to dissuade him, but he insisted that it was absolutely necessary for him to be at the office when the CPA's report was made. "I'll be over there Friday evening or Saturday morning at the latest," he said as she bid him good-bye. And so it was that, despite the pleas of his nurse and the orders of his physician, Jimmy appeared at the plant Friday afternoon. Bince greeted him almost effusively, and Mr. Compton seemed glad to see him again. That evening Harold Bince met Murray at Feinheimer's, and still later the Lizard received word that Murray wanted to see him.
"Everything's ready," the boss explained to the Lizard. "The whole thing's framed for tomorrow night. The watchman was discharged today. Another man is supposed to have been hired to take the job, but of course he won't show up. You meet me here at 7:30 tomorrow night, and I'll give you your final instructions and tell you how to get to the plant."
The CPAs were slow in completing their report. At noon on Saturday it looked very much to Bince that there would be no report ready before Monday. He had spent most of the forenoon pacing his office, and at last, unable longer to stand the strain, he had announced that he was going out to his country club for a game of golf. He returned to his downtown club about dinner time, and at 8 o'clock he called up Elizabeth Compton.
"Come on up," said the girl. "I'm all alone this evening. Father went back to the office to examine some reports that were just finished up late this afternoon."
"I'll be over," said Bince, "as soon as I dress." If there was any trace of surprise or shock in his tones, the girl failed to notice it. At 10 o'clock that night a figure moved silently through the dark shadows of an alleyway in the area of the International Machine Company's plant on West Superior Street. As he moved along, he counted the basement windows silently, and at the fifth window he halted. Just a casual glance he cast up and down the alley, and then, kneeling, he raised the sash and slipped quietly into the darkness of the basement. At about the same time, Jimmy's landlady called him to the telephone, where a man's voice asked if this was Mr. Torrance. Assured that such was the fact, the voice continued,
"I am the new watchman at the plant. There is something wrong here. I can't get hold of Mr. Compton. I think you better come down. I'll be in Mr. Compton's office."
The message ceased, as though Central had disconnected them. Funny, thought Jimmy, that he should call me up. I wonder what the trouble can be. But he lost no time in getting his hat and starting for the works. Although the Lizard knew that there was no danger of detection, yet from long habit he moved through the plant of the International Machine Company with the noiselessness of a disembodied spirit. Occasionally, and just for the briefest instant, he flashed his lamp ahead of him, but though he had never been in the place before, he found it scarcely necessary, so minute had been his instructions for reaching the office from the fifth basement window. The room he sought was on the second floor, and the Lizard had mounted the steps from the basement to the first floor when he was brought to a sudden stop by a noise from the floor above him. The Lizard listened intently. No, he could not be mistaken. Too often had he heard a similar sound. Someone was tiptoeing across the floor above. The Lizard was in the hallway, close beside the stairs, when he realized the footsteps were coming toward the stairway, and a moment later that they were cautiously descending. The Lizard flattened himself against the wall, and if he breathed, his lungs gave forth no sound. If one may interpret footsteps, and the Lizard from the fund of a great experience felt that he could, those descending the stairway from above him might have been described as nervous and repressed, for at least they gave the Lizard the impression of one who desired to flee in haste, and yet dared not do so, for fear of attracting attention by the increased noise that greater speed might entail. At least the Lizard knew that those were the footsteps of no watchman, but whether it be guardian of the law or fellow criminal, the Lizard had no wish to be discovered. He wondered what had gone wrong with Murray's plans, and suddenly imbued with the natural suspicion of the criminal, it occurred to him that the whole thing might be a frame-up to get him. And yet why Murray should wish to get him he could not imagine. He ran over in his mind a list of all those who might feel enmity toward him, but among them all the Lizard could cast upon none who might have sufficient against him to warrant such an elaborate scheme of revenge. The footsteps passed him and continued on toward the foot of the stairs where was the main entrance which opened upon the street. At the door the footsteps halted, and as the Lizard's eyes bored through the darkness in the direction of the other prowler, the latter struck a match upon the panel of the door and lighted a cigarette, revealing his features momentarily but distinctly to the watcher in the shadow of the stairway. Then he opened the door and passed out into the night. The Lizard, listening intently for a few moments to assure himself that there was no one else above, and that the man who had just departed was not returning, at last continued his way to the foot of the stairs, where he ascended to the second floor. Passing through the outer office, he paused a moment before the door to Compton's private office, and then silently turning the knob, he gently pushed the door open and stepped into the room. Beyond the threshold he halted and pressed the button of his flash lamp. For just an instant its faint rays illuminated the interior of the room, and then darkness blotted out the scene. But whatever it was that the little flash lamp had revealed was evidently in the nature of a surprise and perhaps something of a shock to the lizard, for he drew back with a muttered oath, backed quickly out of the room, closed the door after him, and moving much more swiftly than he had entered, retraced his steps to the fifth window on the alley and had gone from the scene with whatever job he had contemplated unexecuted. A half hour later, Detective Headquarters at the Central Station received an anonymous tip. Send someone to the office of the International Machine Company on the second floor of West Superior Street. It was 10:30 when Jimmy reached the plant. He entered the front door with his own latchkey, pressed the button which lighted the stairway and the landing above, and ascending, went straight to Mr. Compton's office, turned the knob and opened the door, to find that the interior was dark. Strange, he thought, that after sending for me, the fellow didn't wait. As these thoughts passed through his mind, he fumbled on the wall for the switch, and finding it, flooded the office with light. As he turned again toward the room, he voiced a sudden exclamation of horror, for on the floor beside the desk lay the body of Mason Compton. As Jimmy stepped quickly toward Compton's body and kneeled beside it, a man tiptoed quietly up the front stairway, while another, having ascended from the rear, was crossing the outer office with equal stealth. Jimmy felt of Compton's face and hands. They were warm, and then he placed his ear close against the man's breast in order to see if he could detect the beating of the heart. He was in this position when he was startled by a gruff voice behind him. "Put him up!" it admonished curtly, and Jimmy turned to see two men standing in the doorway with pistols leveled at him. End of chapter 24. Of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 25. Circumstantial Evidence. At first, Jimmy thought they were the perpetrators of the deed, but almost immediately he recognized one of them as O'Donnell, the erstwhile traffic officer who had been promoted to a detective sergeancy since Jimmy had first met him. "Compton has been murdered," said Jimmy dully. "He is dead."
"Put up your hands!"
snapped O'Donnell for the second time.
"And be quick about it."
It was then for the first time that Jimmy realized the meaning that might be put upon his presence alone in the office with his dead employer. O'Donnell's partner searched him, but found no weapon upon him.
"Where's the gat?"
he asked. "Whoever did this probably took it with him," said Jimmy. "Find the watchman." They made Jimmy sit down in a corner, and while one of them guarded him, the other called up Central, made his report, and asked for an ambulance and the wagon. Then O'Donnell commenced to examine the room. A moment later he found an automatic behind the door across the room from where Compton's body lay.
"Ever see this before?"
asked O'Donnell, holding the pistol up to Jimmy. "If you're asking me if it's mine, no," said Jimmy. "I have a gun, but it's home. I never carry it. I didn't do this, O'Donnell," he continued. "There was no reason why I should do it, so instead of wasting your time on me while the murderer escapes, you'd better get busy on some other theory, too. It won't do any harm, anyway." The wagon came and took Jimmy to the station, and later he was questioned by the lieutenant in charge. "You say this is not your pistol?" asked the police officer. "It is not," replied Jimmy. "You never saw it before?" "No, I have not." The lieutenant turned to one of his men, who went to the door and, opening it, returned almost immediately with Bince. "Do you know this man, Mr. Bince?" asked the lieutenant. "I certainly do," said Bince. "Did you ever see this pistol before?" Bince took the weapon and examined it. "Yes," he said. "Under what circumstances?" asked the lieutenant. "It was one of two that Mr. Compton had in his desk. This one he loaned to Torrance 2 or 3 weeks ago. I was in the office at the time." The officer turned toward Jimmy. "Now, do you recognize it?" "I haven't denied," said Jimmy, "that Mr. Compton had loaned me a pistol. As a matter of fact, I had forgotten all about it. I do not particularly recognize this one as the weapon he loaned me, though it is of the same type. There is no way that I could identify the particular weapon he handed me." "But you admit he loaned you one?" "Yes," said Jimmy. "What did you do with it?" asked the policeman. "I put it in my desk within 5 minutes after he gave it to me, and I haven't seen it since." "You say you couldn't identify the pistol?" said the officer. Jimmy nodded. "Well, we can, and have. The number of this pistol was recorded when Mr. Compton bought it, as was the number of the other one, which is still in his desk. They were the only two pistols he ever bought, according to Mr. Bince and his daughter, aside from one which he had at home, which has also been accounted for. The drawer in which Mr. Bince saw you place this pistol we found open and the pistol gone. It looks pretty bad for you, young fellow. And if you want a chance to dodge the rope, you'd better plead guilty and tell us why you did it." Jimmy was given little opportunity for sleep that night. A half-dozen times he was called back to the lieutenant's office for further questioning. He commenced to realize that the circumstantial evidence was strongly against him, and now, as the girl had warned him, his entirely innocent past was brought up against him simply because his existence had been called to the attention of a policeman, and the same policeman an inscrutable fate had ordained should discover him alone with a murdered man. O'Donnell made the most of his meager knowledge of Jimmy. He told the lieutenant with embellishments of Jimmy's association with such characters as the Lizard and Little Eva, but the police were still at a loss to discover a motive. This, however, was furnished the next morning when Elizabeth Compton, white and heavy-eyed, was brought to the station to identify Jimmy. There was deep compassion in the young man's face as he was ushered into the presence of the stricken girl, while at sight of him hers mirrored horror, contempt, and hatred. "You know this man?" asked the lieutenant.
"Yes," she replied. "His name is Torrance. I have seen him a number of times in the past year. He worked as a clerk in a store in the hosiery department and waited on me there. Later
She hesitated.
I saw him in a place called Feinheimer's. He was a waiter. Then he was a sparring partner, I think they call it, for a prize fighter. Some of my friends took me to a gymnasium to see the fighter training, and I recognized this man. I saw him again when he was driving a milk wagon. He delivered milk at a friend's house where I chanced to be. The last time I saw him was at my father's home. He had obtained employment in my father's plant as an efficiency expert. He seemed to exercise some strange power over father, who believed implicitly in him, until recently, when he evidently commenced to have doubts. For the night that the man was at our house, I was sitting in the music room when they passed through the hallway, and I heard father discharge him. But the fellow pleaded to be retained, and finally father promised to keep him for a while longer, as I recall it, at least until certain work was completed at the plant. I do not know whether father discharged him again or not."
Harriet Holden had accompanied her friend to the police station and was sitting close beside her during the examination, her eyes almost constantly upon the face of the prisoner. She saw no fear there, only an expression of deep-seated sorrow for her friend. The lieutenant was still asking questions when there came a knock at the door, which was immediately opened, revealing O'Donnell with a young woman, whom he brought inside.
"I guess we're getting to the bottom of it,"
announced the sergeant.
"Look who I found working over there as Compton's stenographer."
"Well, who is she?" demanded the lieutenant.
"A Jane who used to hang out at Feinheimer's. She's been running around with this bird. They tell me over there that Compton hired her on this fellow's recommendation. Get hold of the Lizard now, and you'll have the whole bunch."
Thus did Sergeant Patrick O'Donnell solve the entire mystery with Sherlockian ease and dispatch. At Jimmy's preliminary hearing, he was held to the grand jury, and on the strength of the circumstantial evidence against him, that body voted a true bill. Edith Hudson, against whom there was no evidence of any nature, was held as a witness for the state, and a net was thrown out for the Lizard, which dragged in nearly every pickpocket in town, except the man they sought. Jimmy had been in jail for about a week when he received a visitor. A turnkey brought her to his cell. It was Harriet Holden. She greeted him seriously but pleasantly, and then she asked the turnkey if she might go inside.
"Well, it's against the rules, miss," he said, "but I guess it'll be all right."
He recalled that the sheriff had said that the girl's father was a friend of his, and so assumed that it would be safe to relax the rules in her behalf. He had been too long an employee of the county not to know that rules are often elastic to the proper pressure.
"I have been wanting to talk to you," said the girl to Jimmy, "ever since this terrible thing happened. Somehow I cannot believe that you are guilty, and there must be some way in which you can prove your innocence."
"I have been trying to think out how I might," said Jimmy, "but the more I think about it, the more damning the circumstantial evidence against me appears."
"There must be a motive for a crime like that," said Harriet. "I cannot believe that a simple fear of his discharge would be sufficient motive for any man to kill his employer."
"Not to kill a man who had been as good to me as Mr. Compton was," said Jimmy, "or a man whom I admired so much as I did him. As a matter of fact, he was not going to discharge me, Miss Holden, and I had an opportunity there for a very successful future. But now that he is dead, there is no one who could verify such a statement on my part."
"Who could there be, then, who might wish to kill him, and what could the motive be?"
"I can only think," said Jimmy, "of one man, and even in his case the idea is too horrible, too preposterous to be entertained." Harriet Holden looked up at him quickly, a sudden light in her eyes, an expression of almost horrified incredulity upon her face.
"You don't mean—"
she started. "I wouldn't even use his name in connection with the thought," Jimmy interrupted, "but he is the only man of whom I know who could have profited by Mr. Compton's death, and on the other hand, whose entire future would have been blasted, possibly, had Mr. Compton lived until the following morning." The girl remained for half an hour longer, and when she left, she went directly to the home of Elizabeth Compton.
"I told you, Elizabeth," she said, "that I was going to see Mr. Torrance. You dissuaded me for some time, but I finally went today, and I'm glad that I went. No one except yourself could have loved your father more than I, or have been more horrified or grieved at his death. But that is no reason why you should aid in the punishment of an innocent man, as I am confident this man Torrance is. And I tell you, Elizabeth, if you were not prejudiced, you would agree with me. I have talked with Torrance for over half an hour today, and since then nothing can ever make me believe that that man could commit a cold-blooded murder. Harold has always hated him. You admit that yourself. And now you are permitting him to prejudice you against the man purely on the strength of that dislike. I am going to help him. I'm going to do it, not only to obtain justice for him, but to assist in detecting and punishing the true murderer." "I don't see, Harriet, how you can take any interest in such a creature," said Elizabeth. "You know from the circumstances under which we saw him before father employed him what type of man he is, and it was further exemplified by the evidence of his relationship with that common woman of the streets." "He told me about her today," replied Harriet. "He had only known her very casually, but she helped him once, loaned him some money when he needed it. And when he found that she had been a stenographer and wanted to give up the life she had been leading and be straight again, he helped her. I asked Sergeant O'Donnell particularly about that, and even he had to admit there was no evidence whatever to implicate the girl or show that the relations between her and Mr. Torrance had been anything that was not right. And you know yourself how anxious O'Donnell had been to dig up evidence of any kind derogatory to either of them." "How are you going to help him?" asked Elizabeth. "Take flowers and cake to him in jail?" There was a sneer on her face and on her lips. "If he cares for flowers and cakes," replied Harriet, "I probably shall. But I have another plan which will probably be more practical."
End of chapter 25. 26 of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 26. The Only Friends He Has. So it befell that the next day a well-known criminal attorney called on Jimmy Torrance at the county jail.
"I understand," he said to Jimmy, "that you have retained no attorney. I have been instructed by one of my clients to take your case."
Jimmy looked at him in silence for a moment. "Who is going to pay you?" he asked with a smile. "I understand attorneys expect to be paid."
"That needn't worry you,"
replied the lawyer. "You mean that your client is going to pay for my defense? What's his name?"
"That I am not permitted to tell you," replied the lawyer.
"Very well. Tell your client that I appreciate his kindness, but I cannot accept it."
"Don't be a fool," said the attorney. "This client of mine can well afford the expense. And anyway, my instructions are to defend you whether you want me to or not. So I guess you can't help yourself."
Jimmy laughed with the lawyer. "All right," he said. "The first thing I wish you'd do is get Miss Hudson out of jail. There is doubtless some reason for suspicion attaching to me because I was found alone with Mr. Compton's body, and the pistol with which he was shot was one that had been given to me and which I kept in my desk. But there is no earthly reason why she should be detained. She could have had absolutely nothing to do with it."
"I will see what can be done," replied the attorney. "Although I had no instructions to defend her also."
"I will make that one of the conditions under which I will accept your services," said Jimmy. The result was that within a few days Edith was released. From the moment that she left the jail she was aware that she was being shadowed. "I suppose," she thought, "that they expect to open up a fund of new clues through me." But she was disturbed nevertheless, because she realized that it was going to make difficult a thing that she had been trying to find some means to accomplish ever since she had been arrested. She went directly to her apartment and presently took down the telephone receiver, and after calling a public phone in a building downtown, she listened intently while the operator was getting her connection, and before the connection was made she hung up the receiver with a smile, for she had distinctly heard the sound of a man's breathing over the line, and she knew that in all probability O'Donnell had tapped in immediately on learning that she had been released from jail. That evening she attended a local motion picture theater which she often frequented. It was one of those small affairs the width of a city block, with a narrow aisle running down either side and an emergency exit upon the alley at the far end of each aisle. The theater was darkened when she entered, and a quick glance apprising her that no one followed her in immediately, she continued on down one of the side aisles and passed through the doorway into the alley. 5 minutes later she was in a telephone booth in a drugstore 2 blocks away. "Is this Feinheimer's?" she asked after she had got her connection. "I want to talk to Carl." She asked for Carl because she knew that this man, who had been head waiter at Feinheimer's for years, would know her voice. "Is that you, Carl?" she asked as a man's voice finally answered the telephone. "This is little Eva." "Oh, hello," said the man. "I thought you were over at the county jail." "I was released today," she explained. "Well, listen, Carl, I've got to see the lizard. I've simply got to see him tonight. I was being shadowed, but I got away from him. Do you know where he is?" "I guess I could find him," said Carl in a low voice. "You go out to Mother Kruger's. I'll tell him you'll be there in about an hour." "I'll be waiting in a taxi outside," said the girl. "Good," said Carl. "If he isn't there in an hour, you can know that he was afraid to come. He's laying pretty low." "All right," said the girl. "I'll be there. You tell him that he simply must come." She hung up the receiver and then called a taxi. She gave a number on a side street about a half block away, where she knew it would be reasonably dark and consequently less danger of detection. 3/4 of an hour later her taxi drew up beside Mother Kruger's, but the girl did not alight. She had waited but a short time when another taxi swung in beside the roadhouse, turned around and backed up alongside hers. A man stepped out and peered through the glass of her machine. It was the Lizard. Recognizing the girl, he opened the door and took a seat beside her.
Well, inquired the Lizard, what's on your mind?
Jimmy, replied the girl.
I thought so, returned the Lizard. It looks pretty bad for him, don't it? I wish there was some way to help him.
He did not do it, said the girl.
It didn't seem like him, said the Lizard. But I got it straight from a guy who knows that he done it all right.
Who?
Asked Edith. Murray.
I thought he knew a lot about it, said the girl. That's why I sent for you. You haven't got any love for Murray, have you?
No, replied the Lizard. Not so you could notice it.
I think Murray knows a lot about that job. If you want to help Jimmy, I know a way you can get the dope. That will start something anyway.
What is it? Asked the Lizard.
This fella Bince, who's assistant general manager for Compton, got a letter from Murray 2 or 3 weeks before Compton was killed. Murray enclosed a threat signed IWW, and his letter instructed Bince to show the threat to Compton. I haven't got all the dope on it, but I got a hunch that in some way it's connected with this job. Anyway, I've got both Murray's letter and the threat he enclosed. They're hidden in my desk at the plant. I can't get them, of course. They wouldn't let me in the place now, and Murray's so strong with the police that I wouldn't trust them. So I haven't told anyone. What I want is for you to go there tonight and get them.
The Lizard was thinking fast. The girl knew nothing of his connection with the job. She did not know that he had entered Compton's office and had been first to find his dead body. In fact, no one knew that. Even Murray did not know that the Lizard had succeeded in entering the plant, as the latter had told him that he was delayed, and that when he reached there a patrol and ambulance were already backed up in front of the building. He felt that he had enough knowledge, however, to make the conviction of Jimmy a very difficult proposition. But if he divulged the knowledge he had and explained how he came by it, he could readily see that suspicion would be at once transferred from Jimmy to himself. The Lizard, therefore, was in a quandary. Of course, if Murray's connection was ever discovered, the Lizard might then be drawn into it. But if he could keep Murray out, the Lizard would be reasonably safe from suspicion, and now the girl had shown him how he might remove a damaging piece of evidence against Murray.
You will get it, won't you?
Asked the girl. Where are these papers? He asked.
They are in the outer office which adjoins Mr. Compton's. My desk stands at the right of the door as you enter from the main office. Remove the right-hand lower drawer, and you will find the papers lying on the little wooden partition directly underneath the drawer.
All right, said the Lizard. I'll get them.
Bless you, Lizard,
cried the girl.
I knew you would help. You and I are the only friends he has. If we went back on him, he'd be sent up. But there's lots of money being used against him. He might even be hanged. I know from what I've heard that the prosecuting attorney intends to ask for the death penalty.
The Lizard made no reply as he started to leave the taxi.
Take them to his attorney,
said the girl, and she gave him the name and address. The Lizard grunted and entered his own cab. As he did so, a man on a motorcycle drew up on the opposite side and peered through the window. The driver had started his motor as the newcomer approached. From her cab, the girl saw the Lizard and the man on the motorcycle look into each other's face for a moment. Then she heard the Lizard's quick admonition to his driver, "Beat it, Bo!" A sharp "Halt!" came from the man on the motorcycle. But the taxicab leaped forward and, accelerating rapidly, turned to the left into the road toward the city. The girl had guessed at the first glance that the man on the motorcycle was a police officer. As the Lizard's taxi raced away, the officer circled quickly and started in pursuit.
No chance,
thought the girl.
He'll get caught, sure.
She could hear the staccato reports from the open exhaust of the motorcycle diminishing rapidly in the distance, indicating the speed of the pursued and the pursuer. And then from the distance came a shot, and then another and another. She leaned forward and spoke to her own driver.
Go on to Elmhurst, she said, and then come back to the city on the St. Charles Road.
It was after 2 o'clock in the morning when the Lizard entered an apartment on Ashland Avenue, which he had for several years used as a hiding place when the police were hot upon his trail. The people from whom he rented the room were eminently respectable Jews who thought their occasional roomer what he represented himself to be, a special agent for one of the federal departments, a vocation which naturally explained the Lizard's long absences and unusual hours. Once within his room, the Lizard sank into a chair and wiped the perspiration from his forehead, although it was by no means a warm night. He drew a folded paper from his inside pocket, which, when opened, revealed a small piece of wrapping paper within. They were Murray's letter to Bince and the enclosure.
"Believe me," muttered the Lizard, "that was the toughest job I ever pulled off, and all I get is 2 pieces of paper. But I don't know but what they're worth it."
He sat for a long time looking at the papers in his hand, but he did not see them. He was thinking of other things, of prison walls that he had eluded so far through the years of crime, of O'Donnell, whom he knew to be working on the Compton case, and whose boast it had been that sooner or later he would get the Lizard. Of what might naturally be expected were the papers in his hands to fall into the possession of Torrance's attorney. It would mean that Murray would be immediately placed in jeopardy, and the Lizard knew Murray well enough to know that he would sacrifice his best friend to save himself, and the Lizard was by no means Murray's best friend. He realized that he knew more about the Compton murder case than anyone else. He was of the opinion that he could clear it up if he were almost any other than the Lizard, but with the record of his past life against him, would anyone believe him? In order to prove his assertion, it would be necessary to make admissions that might incriminate himself, and there would be Murray and the Compton millions against him. And as he pondered these things, there ran always through his mind the words of the girl. "You and I are the only friends he has."
"Hell!"
ejaculated the Lizard as he rose from his chair and prepared for bed. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 27. The Trial. Edith Hudson spent a restless night, and early in the morning, as early as she thought she could reach him, she called the office of Jimmy's attorney. She told the lawyer that some new evidence was to have been brought in to him, and asked if he had received it. Receiving a negative reply, she asked that she be called the moment it was brought in. All that day and the next she waited, scarcely leaving her room for fear that the call might come while she was away. The days ran into weeks, and still there was no word from the Lizard. Jimmy was brought to trial, and she saw him daily in the courtroom, and as often as they would let her, she would visit him in jail. On several occasions she met Harriet Holden, also visiting him, and she saw that the other young woman was as constant an attendant at court as she. The state had established as unassailable a case as might be built on circumstantial evidence. Krovac had testified that Torrance had made threats against Compton in his presence, and there was no way in which Jimmy's attorneys could refute the perjured statement. Jimmy himself had come to realize that his attorney was fighting now for his life, that the verdict of the jury was already a foregone conclusion, and that the only thing left to fight for now was the question of the penalty. Daily he saw in the courtroom the faces of the 3 girls who had entered so strangely into his life. He noticed, with not a little sorrow and regret, that Elizabeth Compton and Harriet Holden always sat apart, and that they no longer spoke. He saw the effect of the strain of the long trial on Edith Hudson. She looked wan and worried, and then finally she was not in court one day, and later, through Harriet Holden, he learned that she was confined to her room with a bad cold. Jimmy's sentiments toward the 3 women whose interest brought them daily to the courtroom had undergone considerable change. The girl that he had put upon a pedestal to worship from afar, the girl to whom he had given an idealistic love, he saw now in another light. His reverence for her had died hard, but in the face of her arrogance, her vindictiveness, and her petty snobbery, it had finally succumbed, so that when he compared her with the girl who had been of the street, the latter suffered in no way by the comparison. Harriet Holden's friendship and loyalty were a never-ending source of wonderment to him, but he accepted her own explanation, which indeed was fair enough, that her innate sense of justice had compelled her to give him her sympathy and assistance. Just how far that assistance had gone, Jimmy did not know, though of late he had come to suspect that his attorney was being retained by Harriet Holden's father. Bince appeared in the courtroom only when necessity compelled his presence on the witness stand. The nature of the man's testimony was such that, like Krovac's, it was difficult of impeachment, although Jimmy was positive that Bince perjured himself, especially in a statement that he made of a conversation he had with Mr. Compton the morning of the murder, in which he swore that Compton stated that he intended to discharge Torrance that day. The effect of the trial seemed to have made greater inroads upon Bince than upon Jimmy. The latter gave no indication of nervous depression or of worry, while Bince, on the other hand, was thin, pale, and haggard. His hands and face continually moved and twitched as he sat in the courtroom or on the witness chair. Never for an instant was he at rest. Elizabeth Compton had noticed this fact, too, and commented upon it one evening when Bince was at her home.
"What's the matter with you, Harold?" she asked. "You look as though you were on the verge of nervous prostration."
"I've had enough to make any man nervous," retorted Bince irritably. "I can't get over this terrible affair, and in addition, I have had all the weight and responsibility of the business on my shoulders since, and the straightening out of your father's estate, which, by the way, was in pretty bad shape. I wish, Elizabeth," he went on, "that we might be married immediately. I have asked you so many times before, however, and you have always refused, that I suppose it is useless now. I believe that I would get over this nervous condition if you and I were settled down here together. I have no real home, as you know. The club is just a stopping place. I might as well be living in a hotel. If after the day's work I could come home to a regular home, it would do me a world of good, I know. We could be married quietly. There is every reason why we should, especially now that you are left all alone."
"Just what do you mean by immediately?" she asked.
"Tomorrow," he replied.
For a long time she demurred, but finally she acceded to his wishes for an early marriage, though she would not listen to the ceremony being performed the following day. They reached a compromise on Friday morning, a delay of only a few days, and Harold Bince breathed more freely thereafter than he had for a long time before. Mr. and Mrs. Harold Bince entered the courtroom late on Friday morning, following the brief ceremony that had made them man and wife. It had been generally supposed that today the case would go to the jury, as the evidence was all in, and the final arguments of the attorneys which had started the preceding day would be concluded during the morning session. It had been conceded that the judge's charge would be brief and perfunctory, and there was even hope that the jury might return a verdict before the close of the afternoon session. But when Bince and his bride entered the courtroom, they found Torrance's attorney making a motion for the admission of new evidence on the strength of the recent discovery of witnesses, the evidence of whom he claimed would materially alter the aspect of the case. An hour was consumed in argument before the judge finally granted the motion. The first of the new witnesses called was an employee of the International Machine Company. After the usual preliminary questions, the attorney for the defense asked him if he was employed in the plant on the afternoon of March 24th. The reply was in the affirmative.
"Will you tell the jury, please, of any occurrence that you witnessed there that afternoon out of the ordinary?"
"I was working at my machine," said the witness, "when Pete Krovac comes to me and asks me to hide behind the big drill press and watch what the assistant general manager done when he comes through the shop again. So I hides there, and I saw this man Bince come along and drop an envelope beside Krovac's machine, and after he left I come out as Krovac picks it up, and I seen him take some money out of it."
"How much money?"
asked the attorney.
"Oh, there was $50 there. He counted it in front of me."
"Did he say what it was for?"
"Yes. He said Bince gave it to him to croak this fella,"
nodding toward Jimmy.
"What fellow?"
asked the attorney. You mean Mr. Torrance, the defendant?
Yes, sir.
And what else? What happened after that?
Krovac said he'd split it with me if I'd go along and help him.
Did you?
Yes.
What happened?
The guy beat up Krovac and come near to croaking me. I got away.
That is all, said the attorney. The prosecuting attorney, whose repeated objections to the testimony of the witness had been overruled, waived cross-examination. Turning to the clerk, "Please call Stephen Murray," said Jimmy's attorney. Murray, burly and swaggering, took the witness stand. The attorney handed him a letter. It was the letter that Murray had written Bince enclosing the supposed IWW threat. "Did you ever see that before?" he asked. Murray took the letter and read it over several times. He was trying to see in it anything that could possibly prove damaging to him.
"Sure,"
he said at last in a blustering tone of voice.
"I wrote it, but what of it?"
"And this enclosure?" asked the attorney. He handed Murray the slip of soiled wrapping paper with the threat lettered upon it. "This was received with your letter." Murray hesitated before replying.
"Oh," he said, "that ain't nothing. That was a little joke."
"You were seen in Feinheimer's with Mr. Bince on March blank. Do you recall the object of this meeting?"
"Mr. Bince thought there was going to be a strike at his plant. He wanted me to fix it up for him," replied Murray.
"You know the defendant, James Torrance?"
"Yes."
"Didn't he knock you down once for insulting a girl?" Murray flushed, but was compelled to admit the truth of the allegation. "You haven't got much use for him, have you?" continued the attorney.
"No, I haven't," replied Murray.
"You called the defendant on the telephone a half or 3/4 of an hour before the police discovered Mr. Compton's body, did you not?" Murray started to deny that he had done so. Jimmy's attorney stopped him. "Just a moment, Mr. Murray," he said. "If you will stop a moment and give the matter careful thought, I am sure you will recall that you telephoned Mr. Torrance at that time, and that you did it in the presence of a witness." And the attorney pointed toward the back of the courtroom. Murray looked in the direction that the other indicated, and again he paled, and his hand trembled where it rested on the arm of his chair. For seated in the back of the courtroom was the head waiter from Feinheimer's. "Now, do you recall?" asked the attorney. Murray was silent for a moment. Suddenly he half rose from his chair.
"Yes, I remember it," he said. "They are all trying to double-cross me. I had nothing to do with killing Compton. That wasn't in the deal at all. Ask that man there. He will tell me what I had nothing to do with killing Compton. He hired me, and he knows."
And with shaking finger, Murray pointed at Mr. Harold Bince, where he sat with his wife beside the prosecuting attorney. End of chapter 27. 28 of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. Chapter 28. The Verdict. For a moment there was tense silence in the courtroom, which was broken by the defense's perfunctory "Take the witness" to the prosecuting attorney, but again cross-examination was waived. "Call the next witness, please." And a moment later the Lizard emerged from the witness room. "I wish you would tell the jury," said the counsel for defense after the witness had been sworn, "just what you told me in my office yesterday afternoon."
"Yes, sir," said the Lizard. "You see, it was like this. Murray there sent for me and tells me that he's got a job for me. He wants me to go and crack a safe at the International Machine Company's plant. He said there was a fellow on the inside helping him, that there wouldn't be any watchman there that night, and that in the safe I was to crack was some books and papers that was to be destroyed, and on top of it was $3,000 or $4,000 in payroll money that I was to have as my pay for the job. Well, Murray told me that the guy on the inside who wanted the job done had been working some kind of a payroll graft, and he wanted the records destroyed, and he also wanted to get rid of the guy that was hep to what he'd been doing. Well, All that I had to do was go and crack the safe and get the records, which I was to throw in the river and keep the money for myself. But the frame up on the other guy was to send him a phony message that'd get him to the plant after I got through, and then notify the police so they could catch him there in the room with the cracked safe. I didn't know who they was framing this job on. If I had, wouldn't have had nothing to do with it. Well, I goes to the plant and finds a window in the basement open, just as they tells me it will be. But when I gets on the first floor, just before I go upstairs to the office, which is on the second floor, I heard someone walking around upstairs. I hid in the hallway while he came down. He stopped at the front door and lighted a cigarette, and then he went on out, and I went upstairs to finish the job. When I gets in Compton's office, where the safe is, I flashes my light, and the first thing I see is Compton's body on the floor beside his desk. That kind of stuff ain't in my line, so I beats it out without cracking the safe. That's all I know about it until I sees the papers. And then for a while I was afraid to say anything because this guy O'Donnell has it in for me, and I know enough about police methods to know that they would frame up a good case of murder against me. But after a while Miss Hudson finds me and puts it up to me straight that this guy Torrance hasn't got no friends except her and me. Of course, she didn't know how much I knew, but I did, and it's been worrying me ever since. I was waiting, though, hoping that something would turn up so that he would be acquitted, but I've been watching the papers close, and I seen yesterday that there wasn't much chance. So here I am.
You say that a man came down from Mr. Compton's office just before you went up. What time was that?
It was about 10 o'clock, about half an hour before the cops finds Torrance there.
And then you went upstairs and found Mr. Compton dead.
Yes, sir.
You say this man that came downstairs stopped and lighted a cigarette before he left the building. Did you see his face?
Yes, I did.
Would you recognize him if you saw him again?
Sure.
Look around the courtroom and see if you can find him here.
Sure I can find him. I seen him when I first came in, but I can't see his face because he's hiding behind the prosecuting attorney.
All eyes were turned in the direction of the prosecuting attorney to see Bince leap suddenly to his feet and lean forward upon the desk before him, supported by a trembling arm as he shook his finger at the lizard and in high-pitched tones screamed, "It's a lie! It's a lie!" For a moment longer he stood looking wildly about the room, and then with rapid strides he crossed it to an open window, and before anyone could interfere he vaulted out, to fall 4 stories to the cement sidewalk below. For several minutes pandemonium reigned in the courtroom. Elizabeth Compton Bince swooned, and when she regained consciousness she found herself in the arms of Harriet Holden.
"Take me home, Harriet," she asked. "Take me away from this place. Take me to your home. I do not want to go back to mine yet."
Half an hour later, in accordance with the judge's charge to the jury, a verdict of not guilty was rendered in the case of the people of Illinois versus James Torrance, Jr. Mr. Holden and Jimmy's attorney were the first to congratulate him, and the former insisted that he come home with him to dinner. "I'm sorry," said Jimmy. "I should like to immensely, but there is someone I must see first. If I may, I should like to come out later in the evening to thank you and Miss Holden." Jimmy searched about the courtroom until he found the lizard. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "Don't then," said the lizard. "Who you ought to thank is that little girl who's sick in bed up on the north side." "That's just where I'm going now," said Jimmy. "Is she very sick?" "Pneumonia," said the lizard. "I telephoned her doctor just before I came over here. And I guess if you want to see her at all, you'd better hurry." "It's not that bad, is it?" Jimmy said. "I'm afraid it is," said the lizard. Jimmy lost no time in reaching the street and calling a taxi. A nurse admitted him to the apartment. "How is she?" he asked. The nurse shook her head. "Can she see anyone?" "It won't make any difference now," said the nurse. And Jimmy was led into the room where the girl, wasted by fever and suffering, lay in a half comatose condition upon her narrow bed.
Jimmy crossed the room and laid his hand upon her forehead, and at the touch she opened her eyes and looked up at him. He saw that she recognized him and was trying to say something, and he kneeled beside the bed so that his ear might be closer to her lips.
"Jimmy," she whispered, "are you free? Tell me."
He told her briefly of what had happened.
"I am so happy," she murmured. "Oh, Jimmy, I am so happy."
He took one of her wasted hands in his own and carried it to his lips.
"Not on the hand," she said faintly. "Just once on the lips before I die."
He gathered her in his arms and lifted her face to his.
"Dear little girl," he said, "you are not going to die. It's not as bad as that."
She did not reply, but only clung to him tightly, and against his cheek he felt her tears and a little choking sob before she relaxed, and he laid her back again on her pillow. He thought she was dead then, and he called the nurse, but she still breathed, though her eyes were closed. Jimmy sat down on the edge of the bed beside her and stroked her hand. After a while she roused and opened her eyes.
"Jimmy," she said, "will you stay with me till I go?"
The man could make no articulate response, but he pressed her hand reassuringly. She was silent again for some time. Once more she whispered faintly, so faintly that he had to lean close to catch her words.
"Miss Holden," she whispered. "She's a good girl. It is she who hired the attorney for you. Go to her, Jimmy, when I am gone. She loves you."
Again there was a long pause.
"Goodbye, Jimmy,"
she whispered at last. The nurse was standing at the foot of the bed. She came and put her hand on Jimmy's shoulder.
"It is too bad," she said. "She was such a good girl." "Yes," said Jimmy. "I think she was the best little girl I ever knew." It was after 9 o'clock when Jimmy, depressed and sorrowful, arrived at the Holden home. The houseman who admitted him told him that Mr. Holden had been called out, but that Miss Holden was expecting him, and he ushered Jimmy to the big living room, and to his consternation he saw that Elizabeth Compton was there with Harriet. The latter came forward to greet him, and to his surprise the other girl followed her. "I discovered today, Mr. Torrance," she said, "that I have wronged you. However unintentionally it was, the fact remains that I might have done you a very great harm and injustice. I realize now how very different things might have been if I had listened to you and believed in you at first. Harriet told me that you were coming tonight, and I asked to see you for just a moment to tell you this, and also to ask you if you would continue with the International Machine Company. There is no one now whom I feel I would have so much confidence in as you. I wish you would come back and take charge for me. If you will tell me that you will consider it, we will arrange the details later." If an archangel had suddenly condescended to honor him with an invitation to assist in the management of heaven, Jimmy could not have been more surprised. He realized at what cost of pride and self-esteem the offer must have been made, and acknowledgment of error. He told her that he would be very glad to assist her, for the present at least, and then she excused herself on the plea of nervous exhaustion and went to her room. "Do you know," said Harriet after Elizabeth had gone, "she really feels worse over her past attitude toward you than she does over Harold's death. I think she realizes now what I have told her from the first, that she never really loved him. Of course her pride has suffered terribly, but she will get over that quickly enough. But, I have not had an opportunity before to congratulate you. I wish that I might have been there to have heard the verdict, but really you don't look half so happy as I should think you would feel." "Oh, I am happy about that," said Jimmy, "but on top of my happiness comes a sorrow. I just came from Edith's apartment. She died while I was there." Harriet gave a little cry of shocked surprise. "Oh, Jimmy," she cried, laying her hand upon his arm. Oh, Jimmy, I'm so sorry.
It was the first time that she had ever addressed him by his given name, but there seemed nothing strange or unusual in the occurrence.
She was such a good little girl,
said Harriet. It was strange that so many should use these same words in connection with Edith Hudson, and even this girl, so far removed from the sphere in which little Eva had existed and who knew something of her past, could yet call her good. It gave Jimmy a new insight into the sweetness and charity of Harriet Holden's character. Yes, he said, her soul and her heart were good and pure.
She believed so in you, said the girl. She thought you were the best man who ever lived. She told me that you were the only really good man she'd ever known, and her confidence and belief in you were contagious. You will probably never know all that she did for you. It was really she that imbued my father and his attorney with a belief in your innocence, and it was she who influenced the lizard to take the stand in your behalf. Yes, she was a very good friend.
And you have been a good friend, said Jimmy. In the face of the same circumstances that turned Miss Compton against me, you believed in me. Your generosity made it possible for me to be defended by the best attorney in Chicago. But more than all that to me has been your friendship and the consciousness of your sympathy at a time when, above all things, I needed sympathy. And now, after all you have done for me, I came to ask still more of you.
What do you want?
She asked. She was standing very close to him, looking up in his face. You, Harriet? He said. She smiled tremulously.
I have been yours for a long time, Jimmy, but you didn't know it.
End of The Efficiency Expert by Edgar Rice Burroughs.